This is the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project. It's a series of video interviews with people who have made Nebraska broadcasting what it is today, the history of decades of personalities in Nebraska broadcasting. Today we're at the studios of UNO Television in Omaha. I'm Neil Nelkin for the NBA. Seems that almost his entire life has been involved with or around radio. He's built stations, he's run stations, and he's known some of the most important people in radio since the 1960s. A list of call letters he's been associated with over the years is amazing. He's seen the changes in the radio industry almost as much as anybody else, and from the days of stringent FCC regulation to the deregulation of the 1980s and 1990s. He has lots of history, lots of opinions, and we'll learn as much as we can from him on this interview. We want to welcome Dave Messing to the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project. Dave, good to see you.
Thank you, Neil.
Why don't we start back at the very beginning and tell us a little bit about your early days and how they led to radio?
Well, it's growing up on a farm, and you needed the news, and you needed the market reports and the weather, and it was either KFAB while we were out milking cows, or it was KMA with Frank Field at 7:15 in the morning, and then again at 12:15, Earl May was on, Ed May, his son, so, and of course, Mother listening to the homemakers.
Not to date you, but what year was this, as far as you can remember?
Well, the late 40s, and of course, you know, all the stuff going on with the Korean War, you know. And my father followed that news every hour. He was a farmer and an inventor, and he manufactured farm machinery at Gilead, Nebraska. And but he was really hooked into what was going on with the world, and of course, every hour he was tuned in on KFAB News.
When did you decide that maybe this was something you wanted to be a part of?
Well, I think that I was in the 8th grade, and a local bachelor farmer at Gilead was a ham radio operator, and that hooked me.
And you decided to go to the local radio station and become a part of the business?
Well, sort of. You know, I was hooked on ham radio, and I thought, you know, I like this so much. How do I turn it into making money? How do I get paid doing this? And so I went to Superior, Nebraska, which was 40 miles away, and made an application, and they came out, and that was how we got started.
So you got hired at KRFS.
In Superior.
In Superior, Nebraska. Didn't know anything about radio?
Well, I knew a lot about engineering because I had to keep my own transmitter going, and so that was a value added to these guys, because not only did they get an air guy, but I kept the transmitter going.
So what were your duties there? I mean, give me your typical day at KRFS.
Well, I was working during the summer there, and then I gave notice because it was time for school to start, and I said, I got to go back to Hebron to finish high school. And they said, oh no. You aren't out of school yet? You're going to finish here. And so we'll arrange that. We'll make that happen. So, and then one of the duties, it was after school, and I had, a program, dedication program. We took requests and had a lot of fun with that. Also, one of the duties was we had some live entertainers, and we had the KRFS Rangers. And they came in, they were guys from the local area. And then we would have a guest from the KOLN TV Rangers that came in quite often by the name of Monty Martin. And Monty Martin later became Boxcar Willie.
All because of you?
Well, I don't know about that, but it was kind of fun to have seen that part of radio and have experienced live entertainers and emceeing them.
You experienced radio back in the days of real small market radio, mom and pop radio stations, the way it was back then. You've never really forgotten that, have you?
Oh, I love it. And had an opportunity to move up to larger jobs and better jobs. And I was working in Grand Island at the time, and it was either a decision then to go bigger as a DJ and or learn how to run a small town radio station, and I took the fork in the road. And one of the guys that was in a smaller market than me at the time was Art Ferguson, and his real name later was Charlie Tuna. He left and went to Wichita KLEO, then he went down to KLMA, then he was one of the boss jocks on KHJ.
Back in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah, it would have been, yep. And so at one time, I was in a bigger market than Charlie Tuna.
And Charlie Tuna, Art Ferguson, is also a member in the Nebraska Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame. You've been through a lot of markets, big markets, small markets. One of the things at KRFS that you can get away with in a small market probably can't do today, you're 48 hours locked in a vehicle. Tell me about that.
That was actually at KGMT.
Okay.
And they had a promotion. Hebron Chamber of Commerce had a promotion where they locked me in an international scout for 48 hours without sleep. And during that time, I made a challenge to President Kennedy because I had a Kennedy rocker inside the international scout. And sometimes, Neil, they ask me how the bathroom facilities work. Well, the Chamber of Commerce had duty. They had a big tarp that they put around the car, and they brought a little, chamber pot. And so anyway, that's how we survived,
You did last the 48 hours.
Oh yeah, and then that made national news because the teletype came out. The Nebraska AP was covering it real well, but then the national AP grabbed it and said that I had challenged the president.
You became a bit of a local celebrity.
Oh well, we had our fun with it.
From KGMT, that was Fairbury?
Yes.
And Superior, KRFS. Where did you move on, and how did you start on your way to so many different radio stations?
Well, I worked for Stewart Broadcasting, Dick Chapin, at KRGI in Grand Island.
Dave's messing up KRGI.
Messing with music all night now until 10. It's 3 minutes past 8 DM and the PM.
A lot of things they do right. Stewart knew how to run a very successful radio station in a medium-sized market. And one of the things I learned there, Neil, was I was intrigued with was their party line show, where people called in, bought, sell, made comments type things. And there was a guy who bought a radio station in a little town in Marysville, Kansas, and I thought, well, maybe weekends I'll pick up more engineering experience, and I wrote him a letter. And his name was Art Stanley, and Art, I started going down there, getting more engineering experience, and he said he wanted me to join him, and he would teach me how to be a manager. Best move I ever made.
So you learned to be a radio station manager and gave up your on-air career.
Well, I don't know about that. When you're a manager, you get to do everything. Everything.
So you can schedule yourself on air. The Stewart stations, very successful, stations all across Nebraska and into Iowa. What was it you learned working under Dick Chapin, under Jim Stewart, in that organization?
Well, there's just a lot of good organizational skills there. And the way they handled their personnel, I like that. They knew how to get the best out of everybody.
And those were the days when they actually ran their local radio stations.
Oh, yes.
And it was a different time and a different place. You met a lot of people working there at KRGI, and then you moved on to where?
Well, Marysville, Kansas, and loved it there. And then Vietnam was hot and heavy. Came along with a call-up of the National Guard Brigade, and we went to Fort Carson, Colorado. Ended up running the hospital radio station at Fort Carson, and also was at the Army PIO, Public Information Office, where we recorded material for the Army to be used on the Colorado Springs radio stations.
So that got you into that part of military service and military broadcasting. When you came out, where did you go? Back to Nebraska?
I did. While I was in Colorado Springs, one of the things that was kind of a disappointing thing in some ways. There was a broadcasting school. I taught engineering in that school. And back then, you know, first-class tickets were needed at radio stations with directional antenna arrays. And if you wanted to be a big-time DJ, you needed a first-class license. That's just the way it was. And so all these guys that were working in menial jobs around Colorado Springs, they wanted to be DJs. Well, to try to teach them the theory and how to do basic math and get the first-class license was not an easy task. Meanwhile, there were schools in Kansas City and in Minneapolis that were cranking them out because they had the actual questions and answers.
And they didn't teach you engineering theory, they just taught you how to answer the questions on
That's
the
right.
test.
When they knew, in those schools, when you were taking a test that was test W, and you saw question 16, you know the answer was D without reading the question, you know. That was how they memorized. But I did that and worked at a couple of radio stations in the Springs. The #1 rocker I worked at Kissin. This is all evening hours after my duties at the Army. And then I went to work for the #3 station for about 3 times as much money because everybody wanted to work at the rocker. But I was interested in making a living.
The right reason. When did you come back to Omaha and where'd you end up?
Well, I was in the Army, and through an association with a friend of mine that I knew from the days at Superior. His father was an accountant for International Harvester in Kansas City. Charlie Warga's sister was an accountant at International Harvester in Kansas City. And she had a chat one day, and she said, my brother is building a radio station in Plattsmouth. Would you know of anybody? Well, there was the connection right away. And Charlie called me, and I, at the time, that would have been 1969, he said, when you get out of the Army, will you come back and build my station and manage it? And I said, yeah, because the thing of it was, at that time, there'd been a long time freeze on AM radio stations. And I thought, at that point in time, there would have been no more licenses granted for AM stations. And it was a directional station, and that intrigued me because I wanted the opportunity to put on a directional AM. And it was a good experience. Charlie really had a lot of good ideas for Plattsmouth, and I blended right in with him.
That station became?
KOTD.
KOTD at 1,000?
On the dial.
On the dial. And OTD stood for?
Keep 1,000 dialed. Yeah, we wanted something like coil, and when we wanted some kind of a word like KCOD or something, but I remember at that time that was assigned to a ship at sea or something we couldn't get. So we had to take what we could kind of get, you know.
KOTD Plattsmouth, where did you put the towers?
North edge of town.
On a hill?
On a hill. Poorest place in the world, absolutely, for an AM radio station. Because it should be, you know, down where the fertile, wet ground is, because AM works better. FM, you know, you think taller, higher hills better, but not the case for AM.
AM, you want ground conductivity, and didn't have that on the hill.
No.
So you were running the station after you built it?
I did.
How'd you do?
Oh, good. Did real well.
Plattsmouth was a good opportunity
Yes,
for
it
you.
was.
How long were you there?
I was there, actually, when I got there, the license was taking a time. And there's a little bit of story about KOTD. May I share that with you?
Absolutely.
Well, there was a lawyer in the JAG section at Offutt Air Force Base. His name was Michael Starr, and his brother Peter Starr. And there was a different Starr corporation than what the Starr Coil Group was.
That was Don Burden.
Yeah, I think one had one R in the Starr, and the other one had 2 R's. And so Michael Starr, having a brother, Peter Starr, with 7 AMs and 7 FMs, had the full complement. Because at that time, Neil, you could only have 7 AMs, 7 FMs, and 7 TVs.
Right.
That was an FCC limit. And so he knew his brother was doing well in broadcasting. Thought, well, you know, maybe I ought to have a station.
I can do that as well.
So he went to the local real estate agent, which was Charlie Wargan, and said, find me a piece of ground. Well, neither one were engineers or had a background at that time in it. And Charlie sold him a piece of ground, or located for him on the north edge of town. That's where the location was established. And then in that interim, Michael Starr, the brother of Peter Starr, Michael's brother, said, "Why don't you come join me in my broadcast group?" Well, then that made too many for Michael Starr. Here's Charlie now with an opportunity he's learned about. And Charlie had a radio TV shop for years, and he had a background in basic how radios work, and just good about everything, whatever he does. You know, grew up on a farm and knows how to make things happen. And so Charlie decided then to build the station for himself, but he needed somebody to make it happen, and that's how the dots are connected. But in the meantime, Neil, what was kind of interesting about it all, you have to think these things through. You can't just do them instantly. Well, in the meantime, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, came up with an application just before Charlie got his in, and originally there was 2 towers. They had to protect a big Chicago station to the east.
1,000.
And that would have put a beautiful signal into Omaha. But with the station going on the air in Sioux Falls and having to add a 3rd tower and pulling all the station from the north, all the signal from the north, that meant then that they had a stronger signal in North Kansas City than they had in South Omaha.
Not what you expected.
No.
So when did you move on from Plattsmouth?
The thing is, Neil, it didn't really matter because we were a Plattsmouth radio station.
And you served the local community.
We didn't really need Omaha, that much.
So when did you get out of Plattsmouth and where did you go?
I was looking to buy the Falls City radio station. And not that Charlie wasn't taking good care of me. I liked working with him a lot. But I thought, well, it's nothing like having your own. And at that time, Falls City had, prior to that, a broadcasting school. And
Falls City, Nebraska.
yes, and they had a broadcasting school. And it was in the former theater of Falls City. And it had fallen in hard times, and there were chains on the door, and the station was off the air, and the referee of bankruptcy was running the show. And I went down to look that over, stopped back in Nebraska City on the way home for a sandwich about 9 o'clock at night, and the local manager of the radio station was down at the Elks Club. He said, "What are you doing in my town?" At 9 o'clock, how we have fun with each other. And I said, "Well, it's none of your business." And it started with that, and after a while, we loosened up a little bit, and I told him I was looking at Falls City, and he said, "Why don't you come to work for us? We're putting a group together." And he said, "I want you to go to Wichita Falls, Texas." I said, "Well, all my family lives here in this area, and why would I want to go to Texas?" And so it ended up that the owner from Ohio, Carl Adams, had Mr. Clark, had a conversation with him. He went to Wichita Falls, Texas, and I went to Nebraska City, and I was there for running the station for Carl Adams 20 years.
Successfully, I might add.
Oh, no, we had a good time.
Okay, after Nebraska City, is that when you came to the Omaha area?
No, in the interim, backing up, working for Charlie. I'm waiting for the license to
Charlie Warga.
Yep, waiting for the license to come. And my wife had worked in Kansas at KFRM, and she was experienced in traffic and broadcasting. So she went to work at KBON for Frank Scott.
At KBON, 1490, Omaha.
Yep, by the way, the first, I think the only talk station that there was in Nebraska. That was talk radio. Full time. No music was played.
Now, Frank Scott was not the manager at that time.
Oh, yes, he was.
He was.
Yep.
When you came to KBON, Frank was running things.
Yes.
Who else was there?
Well, the overnight news guy that nobody paid any attention to was Chuck Hagel.
He's done well for himself.
Well, yeah. Well, and I always regretted I think probably the only real regret I have in radio is why didn't I have him down to Plattsmouth for a couple of beers? I could have maybe got an appointment,
Well, you could have maybe helped him make something of himself.
Oh, no way about that. But
Another guy who is a legendary Nebraska broadcaster in so many areas, Lyle Demoss. He worked at KBON.
Yes, he did. Lyle Demoss was one of the fixtures here in Omaha, and I originally had applied at KBON. Mike Bradley was a longtime personality at the mighty 1290, but he was our star announcer at KBON. He was going to go to California at the time, and I applied and got his position. He changed his mind, and he was going to stay, and they looked at my resume and said, "Oh, you're an engineer." And really not the right thing to do in Omaha, because there's too much to do either. If you're going to be an engineer, you need to be an engineer. Well, anyway, I directed the Lyle Demoss show and then was chief engineer of KBON.
What was Lyle Demoss like to work with, and what did he do on the air?
He would talk about anything. And we had a tape delay system, and I'm not sure how far I can go into this with the tape delay, but one of the popular things at Thanksgiving time was to cook the turkey in the paper bag. And Lyle Demoss, would have Billy Oakley on at different times. And Billy
Oakley was a homemaker, did radio homemaker shows.
And Billy Oakley and Lyle Demoss worked together in York, Nebraska in the 1930s, for some veterinarian who owned a radio station there. But
that's a whole different story.
They would tell they had this whole thing going on. Anyway, so one of the popular things that Lyle would still do would be recipes. And people would call up. And this guy had this marvelous way of cooking a turkey. And everybody, Lyle was rolling his eyes, and not another turkey in the bag recipe. And he went through the whole thing about you prepare the turkey, you do this and this and that. And you set the temperature for 350 degrees. Oh, he said there's a secret ingredient. You use raw popcorn. And
in the bag with the turkey?
In the turkey.
Okay.
Stuff the turkey. So anyway, and Lyle's starting to get a little bit intrigued by this. And we have this tape delay system. This is before the days that we had digital delays. We had a cartridge tape with 15 seconds of tape on it. And by the end of the day, that tape, you could see your face in it. It was that shiny, because that's how many times it rolled through, in 24 hours. It was a new tape every day. Anyway, we had this 15-second delay, and Lyle said, one thing you haven't told us is how long you cooked this turkey. And the guy says on the air, well, that's the beautiful part of this recipe. That's why you use popcorn. When the popcorn blows a blank off the end of the turkey, it's done. And
that was kind of the first pop-up timer.
Oh yeah, we had some kind of a little cuckoo boo thing that come out on the air and fill that gap with 10 seconds. And
so you did that? You produced that show? You were the engineer for the radio station?
There was a little round button there, recessed button with a red on it. That's the button you pushed, the kill button. And I think Lyle thought he put his finger through that metal panel.
He didn't say blank, he used the word.
Well, yeah, he used the word, the real word. And
back then you couldn't say that on the radio.
Oh, no, absolutely not. No. I'm not even sure we can say it here.
Well, we're not on the air. It's on tape, so nobody can complain. And if they did, who would they complain to?
Well, you never know. It might make air sometime, Neil, and we don't want to lose that opportunity, do we?
Another fellow you mentioned, a guy that I knew, that you say is one of the better acquaintances in radio. That's a guy named Joe DiNatale, who worked for the Stewart stations, ran the station in North Platte for many, many years, also worked at KFOR over the years. How well did you know Joe?
All I know is I liked him a lot. We'd see each other at the convention.
And the state track meets.
Well, I never went to those. But anyhow, Joe was a really awesome. Didn't he later become the manager for the Chamber of Commerce in North Platte?
Yes. He was very much a community-oriented guy in North Platte and filled almost every role that was necessary. Back in those days, though, you did what we now know as multitasking. We didn't call it that then, but it's really what you were doing. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. You did everything in the radio station. What are your best memories of those days?
Well, I'd have to give a little thought to that. But it was always fun to be able to go out and cover all the events. In Nebraska City, Arbor Day, Applejack. We would do remotes during the Labor Day event for muscular dystrophy. It was always something.
How much has the business changed technically since those days. I mean, you've stayed on top of things, seen the changes that we've come to today. Just how dramatic has that been?
Pretty awesome. I remember I had a big promotion when we put a satellite dish in so it could get the Mutual Radio Network. It was one of those big 12-foot dishes and had to pigeonhole it in the back of the radio station and had a big event.
For the installation of the dish. And we've seen a lot of digital equipment now taking over from the old analog days. But you go back to the days of the old RCA 44 microphones and 77 microphones. Were things actually better, in your opinion, back in those days?
Well, you were certainly serving the community and talking more about what people really wanted to hear that pertained to them. Now when you tune out, I'm an avid AM listener yet at night. I love the DX AM stations. But what the sad part is, Neil, for the most part, there's only about 5 choices on the dial. I mean, as far as there's no diversity.
They're all running the same network
Yeah.
programs, and especially when you get into sports, they're all carrying the same games,
Yes.
which is interesting, or maybe not. We used to serve our communities. We used to have to do something called ascertainment to find out what the interests of the community were,
Yes.
and then had to program to meet those needs and interests in the community.
The issues programs list.
In theory, it's still done, but in practice, really hasn't mattered much other than meeting the FCC rules and regs. Do you think that's cost us an audience?
It does. It has.
Because the people just don't find the same things of interest. Let me take you back one more time. Don Burden, one of Nebraska's most charismatic and some would say most notorious broadcasters. Do you remember Don Burden, and what can you tell me?
I do not know Don Burden. I know of him, and the people I worked for in Kansas were with him at the beginning of some of his ventures with Coyle.
Mm-hmm. And then there was the Meredith organization, which owned radio stations in Omaha, and on to Narragansett and Great Empire and Journal Broadcast Group, and the stations are now part of the Summit organization. Did you know those stations pretty well?
No, but I did know one of the movers and shakers in Nebraska broadcasting were the Gleason brothers, Tom and Mel Gleason from York, Nebraska. And they built Superior, they built Fairbury, they built Wayne. They went on down and built a big UHF in Salina, Kansas before UHF was even spoken by anybody, and then went on into Texas to Beeville, Texas, and built a huge cable television outlet. But those guys made a lot of things happen in Nebraska broadcasting.
And made a lot of money doing it?
Oh, I assume so.
But they served their communities, which is definitely different than what a lot of corporate broadcasters do today. We've seen a lot of changes in the way radio stations are programmed. I take it you don't think it's necessarily an improvement?
No, I think that when President Reagan deregulated broadcasting, and a lot of that was being spoken of at the NAB. I remember one time I was interviewed with Larry King at the NAB, and I said, I do not like what's going on, but we're going to lose our local contact. And what happened, Neil, was that it made a lot of owners and small stations very rich because the venture capitalists came along and purchased those stations and then moved them into big cities like Omaha. They're already overcrowded with radio stations. That and another. That happened with me.
And for instance, in Omaha today, all those stations are now combined into basically 3 or 4 ownership groups that own a multitude of radio stations. But many of them at least are paying lip service to the local community. You have to.
Well, I can remember when Coyle would have their mobile news out all over town with instant reports, and I can remember KFAB was everywhere. All the stations were scrambling for news, and I can remember the first time I met Frank Scott when he was news director of a station before they were a talk station, and there was some event that happened while I was in the being interviewed by them at that time in 1963, and he was moving quick. He was out the door. We don't see that today.
I can picture that image of Frank Scott. Of course, I knew him when much later in life, but he didn't slow down.
Oh no, and at staff meetings it was pretty colorful because he was a star, and I want to say it was the Rifleman that he was on, national. He was an actor.
TV series.
Yeah, he was an actor, and he used to tell us in acting school that you want to use good diction all the time.
And he did.
Yes, he did. And he said they told us in acting school that if you stubbed your toe in the middle of the night on the bed, you would say blank, 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 and he would add all of the diction to it.
I know that Frank eventually went into Washington, D.C., and President Reagan had appointed him the head of the Voice of America. And he ran that operation for quite a few years.
Well, I met a guy last weekend that worked for Voice of America. He says that, and he was checking this on Wiki, so, Wiki is accurate on everything, right? Anyway, he says, actually, he was the director of the European VOA. But I had always understood it was VOA, so.
I had too, and I've got this great picture of Frank Scott with President Reagan in my mind. He used to show that around a lot. Those were different times. I'm going to ask you one more name and ask you to tell me your relationship and the history of a guy named Jorg Klebe. Most people today have no recollection, but you do.
Well, I do. Jorg and I, I managed the station in Nebraska City 20 years for Carl Adams. And my wife and I, Jeannie, were going to buy the station. And we knew exactly what it had to be because I did the majority of the selling. And then with the deregulation that came along, Jorg Klebe was a venture capitalist in New York City. And I think in prior years, Jorg had some involvement backing some minority groups, like in Blair, Nebraska, at KBWH, and I think he had Columbus, Ohio, and he had Ozark, Alabama.
Now, for people that don't recall, KBWH, a Blair, Nebraska radio station, which was operated by African Americans, even though there were no African Americans in Blair, Nebraska.
Well, their interests were, of course, meeting the black interests of Omaha listeners.
North Omaha.
Yep, right.
And that station did cover North Omaha.
Sure.
So Jorg Klebe had an interest there.
He did, and then later he was picking up on the fact, even though that he was an international tax law expert, working for one of the major CPA firms, hired a really good radio consultant, engineering consultant, and they looked all over the United States where they could find an FM that could be upgraded to a major market. Of course, Jorg had some experience with Omaha, and the 97.7 at Nebraska City was one of those possibilities. And that got to be his interest, and right away, where my wife and I were looking at purchasing Nebraska City for X number of dollars, a couple of $100,000 more than that, cash deal was purchased just for the purpose of moving the FM to Omaha.
Now, that would have been KNCY FM?
Mm-hmm. I put that on the air in I'm going to stop and think, it's 77.
Okay.
And I put in all Omaha-built McMartin equipment, built right here at the factory.
Ray McMartin and Charlie Goodrich.
The control console, the transmitter. Charlie Goodrich was the design. He was a senior engineer for McMartin Industries. And, we always promoted shop at home, right?
Right.
And so shouldn't we do that when we buy our broadcast equipment?
Made right here in the south part of Omaha. Yeah. When you moved 97.7 to Omaha, how was it programmed? And what was it targeted to?
Well, I didn't get into that much of it because I was pretty busy with about 3 other ventures for him simultaneously. So I was working on securing land there north of Weeping Water, and that was an interesting time because the limestone mines are at Weeping Water. And on this farm, it was I want to say it was a 100-acre farm, and the cornfields were perfect straight line rows, flat as a pancake, and 1,000-foot, well, it's a 300-meter tower. Was that 987 feet? So that's rounded up to say 1,000 foot. And so you need a lot of space for guy wires on a 1,000-foot tower. And I was trying to work with this farmer who bought that farm in the 50s for like $55,000. And you know what that was going to mean? It was going to mean a lot of taxes for him. And of course, he was a farmer that had property near Papillion, and the encroachment of the city moving south in his area, and it's hard to keep the taxes straight on a farm like that. And so then he looked at other property at Takema, and what we did was a like exchange trade for 320 acres of land at Takema. But I couldn't gain any momentum with this farmer, but we had some heavy rains in the early 1990s, and the southwest corner of that farm was formerly a limestone mine, and it sunk. And it had a hole in it big enough where a large ranch-style house would have disappeared. And it put a blemish on that farm. So we had to find other land. We did a tax exchange trade, got that property, put up that 1,000-foot tower, and then it became Omaha Station. In the meantime, I'm moving the transmitter site from Modale, Iowa for KBWH at Blair to Herman, Nebraska on a bluff. We were doing a buy down on on Clear Lake, Iowa. So that's a directional FM antenna at Blair, Nebraska, pointed right toward Omaha. And then Clear Lake, Iowa accepted some money to reduce their power, and that's how they got more power and more tower for KBWH Blair.
Which puts a terrific signal into Walnut, Iowa right now, today. It's a pretty successful little radio station up there. We've pretty much covered an awful lot of ground and an awful lot of people that you've known. You obviously must feel your life has been pretty rewarding, pretty successful, and feel pretty good about it all.
Oh, yeah.
You love telling the stories, too.
And I know most of the stories
Some you can tell.
Outstate Nebraska, yes. And of course, Mr. Klebe, you asked me, that the question was about Mr. Klebe. He said, I want you to stay and run my stations just like you did for Mr. Adams. When I was with Mr. Adams, we had stations in Wichita Falls, Texas, Montgomery, Alabama, Hopewell, Virginia, DeLand, Florida. And those are all next to major metros. Columbus, Ohio, Mr. Klebe had, and he also had Newburgh, New York, which is right on the north edge of New York City. It's about, 30, 40 miles north.
So he had a pretty successful and wide-ranging radio empire, and made a lot of money.
So a lot of the stations that he had were the same general areas that Mr. Adams had. And it so happened that one of the people I worked with Mr. Adams in Montgomery, Alabama, I ended up hiring as a GM in Ozark, Alabama, which we moved in to Dothan. We bought that, moved studios, and I don't know how many studios I built. Probably, as far as one new AM, which was Plattsmouth, maybe 4 or 5 new FMs, and a ton of studio moves.
So what are you doing now to keep yourself busy?
I'm retired, and I talked to one of your very good friends, Joe Miller, almost daily on ham radio, and he built for you in North Platte, Nebraska radio station.
KXNP 103.5.
And he says that you're the radio man's radio man.
Well, that's very kind of you. Tell him I said hello, please, and extend my regards to Joe. And I'm sure we'll see each other again down the road here, not too far. Our guest today has been a part of Nebraska broadcast history, particularly with regard to radio, for decades. And he's shared much of his history with us, and we owe a great degree of thanks to Dave Messing. Dave, thank you so much.
Welcome.
This has been a production of UNO Television and the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project.